My father did not leave a note. He left the property 211 acres along a drainage off the Wenaha River in the Blue Mountains, a truck that needed the clutch replaced, and a storage unit in Walla Walla that I did not get around to opening for 4 months after the funeral. The note I expected was not there. There was a surveying map of the property, folded and refolded until the crease lines had softened to near paper. And on the back of it, in his handwriting, a single line, "Do not sell this until you understand why I did not." I took that to mean something about taxes. I took that to mean a lot of things that were easier to carry than what it actually meant. That was October of it, was 3 years ago now. 3 years and 4 months. I can give you the date of the first trip out there, the date I found the old structure, the date I got the call from Leon Pruitt, and the date I drove back out with Leon and his colleague, Stanton Greer, and stood at the edge of the timber and understood, finally, what my father had been trying to tell me for the last 20 years of his life without ever finding the words. Dates are what I have. Dates are what I give you when I do not have anything else. I should tell you who I am, because it matters for what follows. I will also tell you, right now, before I give you the chronology, what I encountered on my father's property in the Blue Mountains is what people call Bigfoot. I am not going to spend time on whether I believe that word. I am going to tell you what I documented, what other people documented, and what I cannot document but will carry for the rest of my life. I was a structural engineer for 31 years. I retired 8 months before my father died, which means I spent the last season of his life with more time than I had had in 3 decades and still managed not to drive out to Eastern Oregon to see him. I said I would. I do not make excuses for that. I mention it because the sequence is part of the record. He died. I inherited the property. And I did not go out there until the following September, the one time of year he always said the Blue Mountains were worth the drive. I went, maybe, twice while he was alive. I did not go the September he died, and I went the next one. And I am not sure which of those 2 facts is harder to hold. I drove out on a Thursday. The property sits at roughly 2,200 feet elevation, ponderosa pine on the upper slopes giving way to bunch grass and bitterbrush where the creek drainage opens out. September there means the high desert is starting to assert itself. The light is longer and harder. The shadows come early in the canyon bottoms, and the elk are vocal by 5 in the morning. He had a small structure on the property, a shed-turned cabin that was never quite either. I had not been inside it in 11 years. Karen knew I was going. She asked if I wanted her to come, and I told her it was a property assessment trip, which was accurate. And she looked at me in the way she has, when she knows I am using precision to avoid feeling something, and she let me go without saying that. 6 years in, and she already knows when to let a silence sit. I arrived in the late afternoon. The cabin was intact. Better than I had expected. The roof had been patched sometime in the last several years. The propane tank outside was a newer model than what I remembered, and the padlock on the door was one I had never seen before. Not my father's combination. I had to cut it. Inside, the space had the feeling of a room that had been used recently and then deliberately cleared, not abandoned. Cleared, tools organized. 1 coffee cup on the shelf, clean, a journal on the table, which I did not open that night, which I will come back to. I spent the first afternoon doing what I told Karen I was doing. Walked the fence line on the western boundary. The posts were original, cedar, most of them still sound. Where the fence ran along the upper drainage, I found a section of roughly 60 feet that had been pushed inward, not broken, not damaged in a way consistent with livestock or elk pressure. The wire was intact. The posts had been bent at the base. which requires sustained lateral force applied at ground level, which is not how cattle or deer or elk impact a fence. I documented it with photographs. I noted the direction of displacement, consistent across all 4 affected posts. I noted the absence of tracks in the creek silt, which had been disturbed but not in a patterned way. A black bear will break fence wire. A black bear does not relocate fence posts with their bases intact. I filed that observation and moved on. The second thing I found was on the second day. I was working the eastern timber edge, mapping an old skid road that my father had used to access the upper section of the property. The ponderosa up there are mature growths, some of them 60, 70 feet, base diameter running 3 feet or better. I was measuring one of them, habit, when I noticed the bark condition on the adjacent trees. Rubbing sign is common in September in elk country. The rut was clearly on. I had heard bugling from the canyon below since before first light. But elk rub with their antlers, and the sign is specific, a vertical scar at antler height, roughly 4 to 6 feet, with the characteristic pattern of velvet removal or territorial marking. What I was looking at on 3 of those ponderosas was different. The damage was higher, 8 to 9 feet consistently. It was horizontal, not vertical. It covered more surface area than any antler could produce, and in 2 locations there were what appeared to be compression marks in the bark at the upper edge of the rubbing zone, parallel and spaced in a way that did not correspond to any implement I knew. I measured the height of the lowest damage on the largest tree, 8 feet, 4 inches from the ground. I filed that. I moved on. I am good at filing things. 31 years of structural engineering teaches you to document anomalies without catastrophizing them. The anomaly is a data point. The data point requires additional information before it becomes a conclusion. This is the professional habit that has, in retrospect, defined my response to this entire sequence of events, including the parts I have not told anyone, including the parts I may never tell. I opened the journal that evening. My father was not a detailed writer. The entries were functional, the handwriting compressed and practical. The language of a man who did not see the point of writing what he already knew. The first entry was dated 17 years ago, which was when he bought the property. It said the water rights were in order and the access road needed gravel. The second entry was 2 months later. It said something had been through the northwest pasture, and he could not account for it. Every entry after that, and there were 41 entries over 17 years, I counted them, I read them twice, was about the same subject. Not in the sense of a man frightened into obsession. In the sense of a man keeping a maintenance log. Dates, locations, observations. He never wrote Bigfoot. Never wrote Sasquatch. He wrote it. And after a while he stopped explaining what he meant the way you stop explaining the name of a neighbor you have lived next to for a decade. Entry from 11 years ago, November. Tracks in the mud along the upper creek. 12 inches. No claw impression. Stride pattern wrong for bear. Photographed. Sent to Fish and Wildlife. They said elk. Entry from 9 years ago, August. The structure on the east ridge that was not there in spring. 8 to 10 feet. Branches woven. Not blown down. Not a nest. Something built it. Entry from 6 years ago, October, and this one I have read more times than I can account for. It came to the edge of the north timber, 3 nights in a row. I did not go out to meet it. I think that was the right decision. I am less sure this morning than I was last night. It was looking at the cabin. I do not know what it wanted to know. There were 41 entries. The last one was dated 4 months before he died. It said, Conrad will need to come and see this for himself. I do not have the right words, and I never did. The land will explain it. I sat with that for a while. I am not a credulous person. My professional training is in the application of physical principles to structural problems, load paths, material properties, failure modes. I do not accept propositions without evidence. I was sitting in that cabin, performing a rapid assessment of 41 documented observations made over 17 years by a man I knew to be methodical and unsentimental, and I was trying to determine what parsimonious explanation accounted for all of them together. I could not produce one. I called Karen from the truck, where I had a bar of signal if I kept the window down. She asked how the assessment was going. I told her I had found some interesting documentation. She asked if I was all right, and I said I was, and both of those things were technically accurate. The encounter happened on the third day. I had gone back to the Eastern Timber to continue the Skid Road survey. It was September 14th, early morning, around 6:15, because the elk bugling had been constant from just before 5 and I had given up on sleeping. The light in the Blue Mountains at that hour in September is long and flat, coming from the east across the plateau, throwing everything into high relief. There was a frost on the bunch grass in the open sections. I could see my breath. I was at the edge of the timber when I smelled it. There is no clean way to describe this. It was not a bear smell, which I know from 20 years of hunting in the Cascades' wet fur. Fetid, sharp, immediately recognizable. This was organic but different, deeper, something with an ammonia component that I want to say was territorial, because that is the word that came to me then, and I cannot produce a better one. I stopped. I registered the smell, and I noted that the elk bugling had stopped, which it does when a predator is nearby. I noted that the two Steller's jays that had been working the timber edge were silent. I was performing a sensory inventory, because that is what you do when your nervous system is telling you something your mind has not yet named. Then, I heard the breathing. It was uphill from me, inside the timber, maybe 30 feet. I had not seen it. I had not looked in that direction, because I had no reason to. The breathing was deep and controlled, the rhythm of a large animal that was not exerting itself. I have heard black bear at close range. I have heard elk at close range. This was larger than either. The pattern was different. There was a deliberateness to it that I cannot explain by anatomy alone. It was not hiding. It was waiting. I turned slowly toward the sound. The light was behind me, and the timber was in shadow. What I registered first was the depth at which the upper body sat relative to the tree line, higher than any bear, higher than any elk, too wide across the shoulders for either. My brain ran the categorizations fast and rejected them. No antler silhouette. Posture upright, sustained, not a bear rising to assess a threat. Whatever was in that timber had been standing there, watching me, for longer than I had been standing there registering it. I would estimate 9 feet, though I understand that estimates under stress are unreliable. I am aware of the relevant literature on perceptual accuracy during acute threat response. I know that size is consistently overestimated in low contrast conditions. I am also aware that the upper mark on the ponderosa I measured the previous day was at 8 feet, 4 inches, and that what I was looking at was taller than that mark. I give you both pieces of information, and I will not tell you what to do with them. It did not move. I did not move. This lasted somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 minutes. I cannot reconcile the subjective and objective duration, which is consistent with the literature on time perception under acute stress. What I can tell you is that at no point during this interval did the animal display any behavior consistent with threat display. No vocalization. No false charge. No territorial demonstration of the kind you see in bear encounters, which I have had, and which have a characteristic sequence. What it did was look at me. That is the most accurate description I have. It looked at me with the quality of attention that I associate with assessment, the collection of information, not the initiation of action. Then it turned, not fled. Turned and moved back into the timber with a deliberateness that was, in its own way, more unsettling than flight would have been. Flight would have meant I had startled it. What it did meant it had decided. It moved north through the Ponderosa, uphill, in the direction of the upper boundary, where I had found the displaced fence posts. I watched it for perhaps 40 feet, until the timber absorbed it. I did not follow. I stood at the edge of the timber for some time. I was not frightened in the way I expected to be frightened. I was recalibrating, updating a prior I had held without examining at the prior that the Blue Mountains contained nothing that could not be named by the existing taxonomy. The sensation of finding that prior insufficient is not panic. It is a kind of cold, necessary revision. I have felt it before in professional contexts, when a structural failure reveals an assumption nobody thought to question. I went back to the cabin. I added an entry to my father's journal, because that felt correct. I measured the date and the time, and what I had observed, and what I had ruled out, and what I could not rule out. I did not write down the thing I have not told anyone else. That thing is not in the journal, and it is not in these words. What it did before it turned away the specific thing it did. The thing that was not threat display, and was not submission, and was not any category I had a name for. I have held that privately, because of what it implies. Not about what Bigfoot is. About what Bigfoot has understood about the land. About tenure. About the difference between ownership and belonging. I am not ready to say it. I may not ever be. I called Leon Pruitt from the truck that afternoon. Leon is a wildlife biologist I have known for 12 years, a careful and unsentimental man who works for Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I told him what I had observed. I gave him the measurements. I described the fence posts, the bark damage, the tracks I had found that morning in the mud along the upper creek 15 inches, no claw impression. A stride interval I had measured at roughly 60 inches, which is anatomically inconsistent with any known quadruped in the Blue Mountains. Wood ape, Sasquatch, whatever the right word is. Leon was quiet for a long time. He said he wanted to come out with a colleague. I said yes. He said the colleague was Stanton Greer, who worked in a private research capacity and had specific experience with what Leon described as this type of documented material. I said that was fine. They came out 2 weeks later. I will not describe everything that was documented in those 2 days. I will tell you that Stanton Greer found evidence of occupation in the upper timber that he dated through a combination of methods I will not detail here, as spanning decades, not years. Decades, he found a structure in the northeast corner of the property consistent with structures documented at multiple other sites across the Blue Mountains, the same woven branch construction, the same orientation, the same height. He found a food cache in a rock outcropping above the skid road that held the bones of at least 3 elk, some of them old enough to have been there 10 or 15 years. And he found, in the soil at the base of the largest ponderosa on the upper slope, a partial cast of a track that he estimated conservatively at 16 inches. He has been studying Sasquatch for 22 years. He did not use that word until I did. My father had been on that property for 17 years. The evidence Stanton documented suggested that something else had been on it for considerably longer. The ponderosa, at the base of which the oldest track impressions were found, I measured its growth rings from a nearby blowdown of equivalent diameter. The tree was approximately 90 years old. In the first weeks after Leon and Stanton came out, I thought about it primarily as a documentation problem. What is the correct chain of custody for this kind of evidence? What is the appropriate institutional pathway? I made inquiries. Those inquiries were not productive. The consistent pattern across 3 separate agencies was that inquiries of this type are accepted and then not advanced. I noted the pattern. I did not find it surprising. The Patterson-Gimlin film was shot in 1967 at Bluff Creek, California, and the subject has not been definitively explained or debunked in the 58 years since, not by biomechanists, not by film specialists, not by anyone with the resources and the incentive to settle the question. The Skookum cast, collected in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in 2000 by a research expedition, was examined by primate specialists who concluded it showed a large primate body impression, and that conclusion has not been formally addressed by any wildlife management agency. The institutional pattern is not new. The cryptid has been documented, cast, filmed, and heard on recordings that acoustic analysts cannot explain, and the response from the agencies with jurisdiction over the land where it lives has been consistently silence or misdirection. My father sent photographs to Fish and Wildlife 11 years ago. They told him it was elk. What I think about now is my father. He bought that property 17 years ago. He went out there every September for 17 years. He documented what he found in a journal he left on the table in a cabin he kept the key to, and when he died, he did not tell me what was in it. He left me a single instruction on the back of a surveying map: do not sell this until you understand why I did not. I used to think that was a failure of communication, that he ran out of time, or nerve, or the right words. I do not think that anymore. I think he understood something about what that land is, about what has been using it and for how long, and I think he made a decision about what kind of stewardship was appropriate. Not ownership. Not management. A decision to hold the perimeter and not push past it. To document and not disturb. To come out every September and do his accounting and leave. I think he understood that the land was not his in any way that mattered against the weight of decades of prior occupation by something that has no mechanism for the legal title he held in a filing cabinet in Walla Walla. Karen asked me, after I told her not all of it, but the material facts, what I was going to do with the property. I told her I was going to hold it. She asked if I was sure. I told her I was. She did not ask why, which is the thing about her I did not know I needed until she did it, and I sat with a gratitude for that for longer than I expected. I am still holding it. I go out every September now. I have not seen the Bigfoot again, not directly. I have found evidence of continued presence, which I document. I have heard vocalizations on 2 separate occasions that I cannot assign to any species in the Blue Mountains classification I know, not elk, not coyote, not any owl or nightbird. Stanton Greer says vocalizations are the most commonly reported evidence and the least studied. He says the creature is vocal when it wants to be heard and silent when it does not. I have added 23 entries to the journal. I keep meaning to start a new one, and I have not. The handwriting on the first 41 entries is my father's, and I do not want to put the journal away. There are small things the encounter took. I do not spend a lot of time naming them, because naming them does not change them. The particular ease I used to have in timber, the feeling of knowing a landscape thoroughly enough that it held no surprises, that is gone. I know now that there are things in the landscape that know it more thoroughly than I do, and that knowledge sits differently in the body than any terrain map. The long quiet of property ownership, the particular satisfaction of boundary and title and legal holding that is a smaller thing now against the weight of what I found in that journal, what Stanton Greer documented in the northeast corner, what the growth rings of a 90-year ponderosa suggest about duration and residence, and what those words mean when you apply them to something that has no deed. I drive out every September, and I sit in the cabin my father patched, and I do my accounting, and sometimes in the evening I can hear the elk in the canyon below, and I think about what he was doing all those years out there, the same accounting, and whether he ever made peace with what the land had shown him. I did not ask him when I had the chance. I should have come out when he asked me to come. The journal is still on the table. Both are handwriting in it now. His 41 entries and my 23 and the blank pages that remain, and whatever this land has been holding since before either of us was born, and will go on holding after the title passes to someone else, assuming it passes, assuming I decide to let it go, which I have not decided yet. My father did not decide. I think I understand now why he did not. I think I will not either.